Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews had worked palace security for 12 years, but she had never seen anything like the encrypted folder that appeared on her desk that Tuesday morning. The manila envelope bore the official seal of the Queen Consort's office, and inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports dating back 3 months. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first file and saw Catherine's photograph paper-clipped to a detailed dossier. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the security office at Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across Sarah's desk. She had arrived early, as was her habit, to review the daily briefings and coordinate with the protection teams. But this envelope had not been part of the usual morning delivery. Someone had placed it there deliberately, knowing she would be the first to see it. Sarah's coffee grew cold as she read through the documents. The investigation had been authorized at the highest levels, according to the letterhead, and the scope was breathtaking. Every aspect of Catherine's daily routine had been documented, from her charitable engagements to her private conversations with staff members, phone records, meeting schedules, even grocery lists had been photographed and filed away. The first photograph showed Catherine leaving a small cafe in Notting Hill, her security detail maintaining their usual discreet distance. But there was something different about this image. A red circle had been drawn around a figure in the background, a woman with short gray hair wearing a dark coat. Sarah squinted at the image, trying to make out the face, but the quality was too poor to identify the person clearly. As she continued reading, Sarah realized this was not a routine security assessment. The tone of the reports was clinical, almost hostile. Every gesture, every expression on Catherine's face had been analyzed and interpreted through a lens of suspicion. The investigators seemed particularly interested in her interactions with certain staff members and her choice of public engagements. One report detailed Catherine's visit to a homeless shelter in East London. The investigator had noted that she spent an unusually long time speaking with the director, a woman named Margaret Thompson. They had met privately in an office away from the cameras, and when Catherine emerged, she appeared emotional and distressed. The report speculated about what might have been discussed during that private conversation. Another document contained transcripts of phone conversations, though it was unclear how they had been obtained. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the invasion of privacy these represented. The conversations were mundane: arrangements for the children's activities, discussions about upcoming events, casual chats with friends, but someone had deemed them important enough to record and analyze. The most disturbing document was a psychological profile that attempted to assess Catherine's loyalty and stability. It cited her background, her family's business dealings, and even her university friendships as potential areas of concern. The profile suggested that her charitable work might be motivated by personal agenda rather than genuine compassion. Sarah had worked closely with Catherine's protection team for years. She had seen the princess interact with people from all walks of life, had witnessed her genuine care and concern for others. The woman described in these reports bore no resemblance to the person Sarah knew. This investigation seemed designed to find fault rather than assess real security concerns. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Detective Constable James Wilson, one of her most trusted team members, entered with his usual morning cheerfulness. "Morning, Sarah. Ready for another exciting day of watching paint dry on palace walls?" His smile faded as he noticed the expression on her face.
"What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost."
Sarah quickly closed the folder and slid it into her desk drawer. Nothing serious, just reviewing some paperwork. "What's the schedule looking like today?" James consulted his tablet. "Pretty standard. Her Royal Highness has a meeting with the Children's Charity Board at 10, lunch with the Danish ambassador's wife at 1, and then a private appointment at 3. William's flying back from Scotland tonight, so she'll probably want to be home early." The private appointment. Do we know what that's about? Sarah tried to keep her voice casual, but something in the investigation files had mentioned a mysterious meeting scheduled for that afternoon. Not really. It's listed as personal business in the diary. Could be anything. Doctor's appointment, meeting with the children's schools, family matters. We'll have the usual security detail, but it's kept deliberately vague. After James left, Sarah returned to the files. The investigation had been ongoing for 3 months, which meant it had started around the time of some minor controversy in the tabloids about Catherine's choice to support a refugee assistance program. The timing seemed significant. As she read further, Sarah began to understand the scope of what was happening. This was not just an investigation into Catherine's activities. It was a comprehensive effort to build a case for something. But what? The documents hinted at concerns about foreign influence and inappropriate associations, but the evidence seemed thin and circumstantial. One report detailed Catherine's friendship with Dr. Satan Amire Hassan, a Syrian refugee who had become a prominent advocate for displaced families. They had met at a charity event 2 years earlier and had maintained a personal friendship since then. The investigator seemed to view this relationship with deep suspicion, noting every meeting, every phone call, every public appearance they had made together. Sarah knew Dr. Hassan personally. The woman was brilliant, compassionate, and had been thoroughly vetted by security services when she first began working with the royal household. The suggestion that this friendship represented some kind of security threat seemed absurd. But as Sarah continued reading, she began to see the pattern. The investigation was not really about security at all. It was about control, about finding leverage, about building a file that could be used to influence or discredit Catherine if necessary. The psychological profile was particularly telling. It read more like opposition research than a genuine assessment of threats. The final document in the folder was the most chilling. It was a recommendations report suggesting enhanced monitoring protocols and interventional strategies to address the perceived concerns. The language was bureaucratic, but the implications were clear. Someone wanted to restrict Catherine's freedom, limit her contacts, and bring her activities under much tighter control. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Who had authorized this investigation? Who had access to these files? And most importantly, who had placed them on her desk this morning? Someone clearly wanted her to see them, but why? She thought about Catherine's schedule for the day. The private appointment at 3 o'clock suddenly seemed much more significant. If the investigation team was watching her closely, they would certainly be interested in any meeting that had been kept deliberately vague. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She reached for her secure phone and dialed the number for Catherine's personal protection officer.
This is Detective Inspector Matthews. I need to speak with you about today's schedule.
There may be a security concern we need to address. As she waited for the connection, Sarah looked out the window at the peaceful gardens of Kensington Palace. The morning joggers were making their usual rounds, the maintenance staff were tending to the flower beds, and everything appeared completely normal. But underneath this calm surface, something much more dangerous was unfolding. The investigation files represented a threat that went far beyond physical security. They represented an attack on Catherine's privacy, her autonomy, and potentially her future role within the royal family. Sarah had dedicated her career to protecting members of the royal household, but she had never faced a threat that came from within the institution itself. When Catherine's protection officer answered the phone, Sarah chose her words carefully. I've received some intelligence that suggests we may need to adjust today's security arrangements. Can you meet me in 15 minutes? And please, keep this conversation strictly between us for now. As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized she was crossing a line. By choosing to act on the information in the files, she was potentially putting her career at risk. But she had taken an oath to protect and serve, and she could not stand by while someone used the security apparatus to conduct what amounted to a harassment campaign against the Princess of Wales. She locked the files back in her desk drawer and stood up, straightening her uniform jacket. Whatever was happening, whatever forces were at work behind the scenes, Sarah Matthews had made her choice. She would stand between Catherine and this investigation, no matter what the cost. The palace corridors were busy with the usual morning activity as Sarah made her way to meet with the protection team. Staff members hurried past with clipboards and coffee cups, preparing for another day of royal engagements. None of them knew that in a small office in the security wing, a decision had been made that would send ripples through the highest levels of the British establishment. As Sarah walked, she thought about the woman she had sworn to protect. Catherine had always treated the security staff with respect and kindness. She remembered birthdays, asked about family members, and never made anyone feel invisible or unimportant. The idea that someone was working to undermine her was not just professionally unacceptable, it was personally offensive. The protection officer was waiting for her in the secure briefing room. a small space lined with soundproofing and electronic countermeasure equipment. Detective Sergeant Michael Torres had been with Catherine's detail for 5 years and had proven himself to be both competent and discreet. "What's the situation, Inspector?" Torres asked as soon as the door closed behind them. Sarah took a deep breath. "I've received information suggesting that Her Royal Highness may be under some form of surveillance beyond our normal security protocols. I can't go into details about the source, but I believe we need to be extra vigilant today." Torres frowned. "What kind of surveillance? Foreign intelligence? Paparazzi? Stalkers? Possibly domestic," Sarah said carefully. "I want you to vary the route to today's appointments, use alternative entrances where possible, and keep a close eye on anyone who seems to be documenting her activities beyond normal media coverage." "Understood. Should I brief the rest of the team?" Sarah considered this. She needed allies, but she also needed to be careful about who she trusted. "Brief Detective Constable Wilson, but keep it general. Tell him we've received a tip about possible unwanted surveillance. Don't mention the domestic angle unless it becomes necessary." After Torres left to prepare for the day's duties, Sarah remained in the briefing room thinking about her next steps. She needed to learn more about who was behind the investigation, but she also needed to find a way to warn Catherine without alarming her unnecessarily. The morning progressed with unusual tension. Sarah monitored the security feeds as Catherine departed for her charity meeting, noting every face in the crowd, every photographer, every person who seemed to be paying unusual attention to the princess's movements. She coordinated with the Metropolitan Police units providing outer perimeter security, but she was careful not to reveal her specific concerns. At 11:30, Sarah's phone rang. It was Torres, calling from the charity meeting. "Inspector, we may have a problem. There's a woman here with media credentials, but she's not from any of the usual outlets. She's been taking photographs, but not of the event. She's focused on documenting everyone Her Royal Highness speaks with. Getting names, noting conversations." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "Have you approached her?" "Not directly, but I've had Wilson keep an eye on her. She arrived before us and seemed to know exactly where to position herself for the best vantage point." Description: middle-aged, short gray hair, dark coat. Professional camera equipment, but she's using it more like surveillance gear than journalism. Sarah's blood ran cold. The woman Torres was describing matched the figure circled in the photograph from the investigation files. This was not a coincidence. "Do not approach her directly," Sarah instructed, "but document everything: her credentials, her media outlet, her registration information if possible, and make sure Her Royal Highness is never alone with any of the charity staff without someone from our team present." After ending the call, Sarah made another difficult decision. She needed backup, but she had to be careful about who she approached. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Harrison had been her mentor when she first joined Palace Security. He was scheduled to retire in 6 months and had always been fiercely protective of the royal family's welfare. If anyone could be trusted with this situation, it would be him. Sarah found Harrison in his office reviewing budget reports with his usual attention to detail. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his desk organized with military precision. He looked up as she entered, noting the tension in her posture immediately. "Sarah, you look troubled. What's on your mind?" She closed the door behind her and activated the sound masking device that prevented electronic eavesdropping. "Chief Inspector, I've stumbled across something that I believe represents a serious threat to the welfare of the Princess of Wales. I need your guidance on how to proceed." Harrison set down his pen and gave her his complete attention. "Tell me everything." Sarah outlined her discovery of the investigation files, being careful to describe their contents without revealing too many specific details. She explained about the woman at the charity event and her growing concern that Catherine was being subjected to unauthorized surveillance. Harrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "These files," he said finally, "do you still have access to them?" "Yes, sir. They're secured in my desk. And you have no idea who placed them there?" "None. But whoever did it wanted me to see them. The timing, the placement, it was deliberate." Harrison stood and walked to the window looking out at the palace grounds. "Sarah, What you're describing sounds like it could be part of an authorized intelligence operation. There may be security concerns about the princess that we're not privy to at our level. With respect, sir, I've read the files. This doesn't feel like legitimate security work. It feels like harassment. Harrison turned back to her. That may be true, but we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If this investigation has been authorized at the highest levels, and we interfere with it, we could find ourselves facing serious consequences. Sarah felt a wave of disappointment. She had hoped Harrison would be more supportive, but she understood his caution. Still, she could not accept inaction. Chief Inspector, I took an oath to protect members of the royal household from all threats, not just foreign ones. If someone is using our own security apparatus to threaten the Princess of Wales, then I believe we have a duty to act. Harrison studied her face for a long moment. What exactly are you proposing? I want to warn her. Discreetly. Give her enough information to protect herself without revealing our sources. And I want to identify who's behind this investigation. That's a dangerous path, Sarah. You could be putting your career at risk. My career doesn't matter if I'm not doing the job I was hired to do. Harrison walked back to his desk and sat down heavily. All right, but we do this carefully, methodically. No rushed decisions, no unnecessary risks. And if it turns out this investigation is legitimate, we back away immediately. Understood? Sarah felt a surge of relief. Understood, sir. First step is intelligence gathering. I want you to research the authorization for this investigation. Check the official channels, see if there are any records of approval at the cabinet level, or through the intelligence services. If this is a legitimate operation, there will be a paper trail. And if there isn't, then we'll know we're dealing with something else entirely. As Sarah left Harrison's office, she felt both relieved and apprehensive. She now had support from her superior, but she also understood the magnitude of what they might be confronting. If the investigation into Catherine was unauthorized, it represented a serious breach of protocol and potentially a criminal conspiracy. If it was authorized, then someone at the highest levels of government or the royal household had signed off on what amounted to a surveillance and harassment campaign. The afternoon brought new developments. Torres reported that the mysterious photographer had disappeared from the charity event shortly after Catherine left, but not before obtaining detailed information about several of the charity workers Catherine had spoken with. More concerning, he had spotted what appeared to be a technical surveillance team in an unmarked van parked near the route between the charity event and Catherine's lunch appointment. Sarah coordinated with the Metropolitan Police to have the van investigated, but by the time officers arrived at the location, it had vanished. The only evidence of its presence was some unusual tire tracks and what appeared to be electronic equipment mounting points on a nearby lamppost. As the day progressed, Sarah became increasingly convinced that Catherine was being subjected to comprehensive surveillance by a well-resourced and professional organization. The level of coordination, the quality of the equipment, and the sophistication of the operation suggested government-level capabilities. At 2:30, Torres called with an urgent update. Inspector, Her Royal Highness just received a phone call that's caused her considerable distress. I don't know what was said, but she's requested that her 3 o'clock appointment be moved to a more private location. She's asked to use one of the secure conference rooms here at the palace rather than going off-site. Sarah felt a chill. Someone was escalating the pressure on Catherine, and the timing was not coincidental. Who was the call from? I don't know. She took it privately, but when she came out, she looked shaken. She's trying to hide it, but I can tell she's upset. Sarah made a decision that she knew would change everything. Torres, I need you to find a way to speak with Her Royal Highness privately. Tell her that there may be security concerns related to her recent activities, and that she should be cautious about any unusual requests or pressure from unexpected sources. Ma'am, that's quite irregular. Shouldn't such a warning come through official channels? Under normal circumstances, yes. But these are not normal circumstances. Use your judgment, but make sure she knows she has allies within the security service. As Sarah prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her career, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. 12 years ago, she had joined palace security because she believed in serving something greater than herself. She had never imagined that the greatest threat to that service might come from within the very institution she had sworn to protect. The files in her desk drawer represented more than an investigation into Catherine's activities. They represented a fundamental question about power, loyalty, and the price of speaking truth to authority. Sarah Matthews had made her choice, but she knew the real challenge was just beginning. The secure conference room at Kensington Palace had been swept for listening devices twice that afternoon, but Sarah Matthews still felt exposed as she waited for Catherine to arrive. The princess had agreed to the private security briefing after Detective Sergeant Torres had carefully approached her following the disturbing phone call. Sarah had spent the past hour reviewing every detail of the investigation files, preparing for a conversation that could define both their futures. Catherine entered the room alone, as Sarah had requested, though Torres remained stationed outside the door. Even under stress, the princess maintained her composed public demeanor, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders and the worried expression she was trying to conceal. Catherine took a seat across from Sarah, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "Detective Inspector Matthews, Sergeant Torres mentioned you have security concerns to discuss with me." He was quite insistent that this meeting remain confidential. Catherine's voice was steady, but Sarah detected an underlying note of apprehension. Sarah had rehearsed this moment, but now that it was happening, she struggled to find the right words. "Your Royal Highness, I've come across information suggesting that you may be subject to surveillance and investigation beyond normal security protocols. I believe you have a right to know about this situation." Catherine's composed facade wavered slightly. "What kind of surveillance? Is this related to the phone call I received earlier?" "I don't know about the phone call specifically, but I have reason to believe that your activities, contacts, and private conversations have been monitored and documented for the past 3 months. This surveillance appears to be systematic and comprehensive." The princess was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Who is conducting this surveillance?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading. "I don't have definitive proof, but the evidence suggests it may be connected to official government or royal household channels. The level of access and resources involved indicates a high-level authorization." Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where her children often played. The phone call earlier was from someone claiming to represent the Cabinet Office. "They requested a meeting to discuss my recent charitable activities, particularly my work with refugee assistance programs. They suggested that some of my associations might be creating diplomatic complications." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Did they specify which associations?" "They mentioned Dr. Christie, Amara Hassan specifically, and my friendship with several families I've worked with through the refugee assistance program. They seemed particularly concerned about my private meetings with these individuals, which they somehow knew about in detail. The investigation files had documented every one of Catherine's meetings with Dr. Hassan and the refugee families. Someone was using that surveillance to apply pressure, exactly as Sarah had feared. "Your Royal Highness, I believe someone is trying to limit your independence and control your activities by using security concerns as justification. The surveillance I've discovered goes far beyond what would be necessary for legitimate protection purposes." Catherine turned back to Sarah, her expression now showing a mixture of anger and determination. "Detective Inspector, I've been feeling increasingly constrained in recent weeks. Small things at first, difficulty scheduling certain meetings, unexpected security concerns for events that had previously been approved, questions about my choice of charities and causes. I began to wonder if I was being paranoid. But if what you're saying is true, it's not paranoia. The documentation I've seen suggests a deliberate campaign to monitor and influence your activities. Someone is building a file that could potentially be used to justify restricting your role or public activities." Catherine returned to her seat, her posture now radiating controlled anger. "Who do you think is behind this?" Sarah had been wrestling with this question since discovering the files. The resources and access required suggest involvement at the highest levels of either the government or the royal household itself. The investigation bears official seals, but I haven't been able to verify the authorization through normal channels. "Have you discussed this with your superiors?" "With Chief Inspector Harrison, yes. He's agreed to help investigate the source of the authorization, but we're proceeding carefully. If this surveillance has been officially approved, our intervention could have serious consequences for our careers." Catherine leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. "Detective Inspector, I appreciate the risk you're taking by coming to me with this information. But I need you to understand something. I will not allow anyone to use security concerns to silence me or prevent me from doing work I believe is important."
Sarah felt a surge of admiration for the princess's courage. "What would you like us to do?" "I want to know who authorized this surveillance and why."
"I want to understand the scope of the investigation and what evidence they think they have against me. And I want to know if my children or my husband are also being monitored." The mention of the children sent a chill through Sarah. She hadn't considered that the surveillance might extend to other family members. "I'll investigate those possibilities immediately." Catherine stood again, beginning to pace the small room. The timing of this is not coincidental. The Refugee Assistance Program has been gaining significant public support, and we've been making progress on some policy initiatives that certain political figures have opposed. Someone may be trying to undermine that work. Sarah remembered reading about the political controversy surrounding refugee policy in recent months. Several cabinet ministers had publicly criticized the expansion of assistance programs, arguing that they sent the wrong message about immigration policy. If Catherine's charitable work was being seen as political advocacy, it could explain the surveillance. "Your Royal Highness, do you have any enemies within the government or royal household who might see your charitable work as threatening to their interests?" Catherine's expression darkened. "There have been tensions. Some members of the family and certain political figures have made it clear they disapprove of my choice to focus on refugee assistance and social justice issues. They prefer the royal family to stick to more traditional charitable causes." Sarah thought about the psychological profile in the investigation files, with its suggestions about Catherine's motivations and loyalty. Someone was clearly trying to build a case that her charitable work represented something more than humanitarian concern. The investigation files include a psychological assessment that questions your motivations and suggests your charitable work might be driven by personal or political agenda, rather than genuine compassion. "Someone is trying to discredit your character." Catherine stopped pacing and fixed Sarah with a steady gaze. "Detective Inspector, I've worked with refugee families for 2 years. I've seen children who've lost everything, parents who've risked their lives to give their families a chance at safety. My motivation is simple. These people need help, and I'm in a position to provide it. Anyone who questions that motivation doesn't understand what I've witnessed." The passion in Catherine's voice reminded Sarah why she had chosen to take this risk. This was not about politics or palace intrigue. It was about protecting someone who was genuinely trying to help vulnerable people. "What about the meeting they've requested? The one from the cabinet office?" Catherine checked her watch. "It's scheduled for 4 o'clock. But I've asked to move it here to the palace. If they're monitoring me, I want to control the environment as much as possible." Sarah felt alarm bells going off. "Your Royal Highness, I would strongly advise against taking that meeting alone. If someone is trying to pressure you, they may use the meeting to make demands or threats. What do you suggest?" Sarah thought quickly. "Request that your private secretary be present to take notes. Insist that any concerns be presented in writing rather than just discussed verbally. And consider having legal counsel available, even if not present in the room." Catherine nodded. "That's good advice. But I also want someone from security present who understands the surveillance situation. Would you be willing to attend?" This would be another line crossed, but Sarah recognized the importance of the moment. "If you request my presence officially, I can attend as your security liaison. Consider it requested." Over the next hour, Sarah and Catherine worked together to prepare for what could be a crucial confrontation. Catherine's private secretary was briefed on the need to document everything, and legal counsel was placed on standby. Sarah coordinated with Torres to ensure additional security measures were in place, though she was careful not to reveal the full scope of their concerns. At 4 o'clock, 2 officials from the Cabinet Office arrived at Kensington Palace. Sarah recognized neither of them, but their credentials appeared legitimate. They were shown to the same secure conference room where Sarah had briefed Catherine earlier. The lead official introduced himself as Deputy Secretary James Whitfield, a thin man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and a bureaucratic manner. His companion was introduced as Ms. Patricia Carlyle, described as a specialist in security assessment. Both carried briefcases and tablets, and both seemed uncomfortable with the formal setting Catherine had arranged. "Your Royal Highness," Whitfield began, "we appreciate you making time for this discussion. We have some concerns about certain aspects of your recent charitable activities that we felt needed to be addressed directly.
Catherine maintained perfect composure. I welcome the opportunity to address any concerns. My private secretary is here to ensure accurate records of our discussion, and Detective Inspector Matthews is present as my security liaison. Whitfield glanced at Sarah with obvious displeasure. This is a sensitive matter, Your Royal Highness. We had hoped to speak with you privately. I prefer to have witnesses present for any official discussions of my charitable activities. Please proceed with your concerns. Carlyle opened her tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Our review has identified several areas where your charitable activities may be creating unintended security vulnerabilities or diplomatic complications. Specifically, your ongoing relationship with Dr. Amara Hassan and certain refugee families has raised questions about potential foreign influence or manipulation. Sarah felt her anger rising. The language was almost identical to the investigation files she had discovered that morning. Catherine leaned forward slightly. I'm not sure I understand. Dr. Hassan is a respected advocate who has been thoroughly vetted by security services. The families I work with are refugees who have been granted legal status in the United Kingdom. How do these relationships create security vulnerabilities? Whitfield took over. The concern is not about the individuals themselves, but about the perception created by your high-profile advocacy for refugee causes. Some within government feel that your activities may be sending mixed messages about immigration policy at a sensitive time. Are you suggesting that I should cease my charitable work with refugee assistance programs? Not cease, but perhaps redirect your focus toward less politically sensitive causes. Traditional royal charities, children's hospitals, military families, environmental conservation, these areas would avoid potential controversy. Catherine's voice remained level, but Sarah could sense the steel beneath her words. Mr. Whitfield, are you speaking for the Prime Minister in making these suggestions? Whitfield hesitated. We represent various interests within government who are concerned about the current trajectory of your charitable activities. Sarah intervened. Could you provide written documentation of these concerns and the authority under which you're making these recommendations? Carlyle shot Sarah an irritated look. This is an informal discussion aimed at avoiding more formal intervention. We hope Your Royal Highness will voluntarily adjust her activities to address these concerns. Catherine stood, effectively ending the meeting. Gentlemen, I appreciate you bringing your concerns to my attention. However, I will need to see specific evidence of any security vulnerabilities or diplomatic complications before considering changes to my charitable work. If such evidence exists, please provide it through official channels with proper authorization.
Whitfield's bureaucratic mask slipped slightly, revealing his frustration.
Your Royal Highness, I hope you understand that continued involvement in potentially controversial causes could have implications for your future role within the royal family. The threat was now explicit. Sarah felt her hand move instinctively toward her radio, ready to call for assistance if the situation escalated further. Catherine's voice became ice-cold. Mr. Whitfield, are you threatening me? Not at all, Your Royal Highness. Simply pointing out the realities of public service and the need for all members of the royal family to consider the broader implications of their actions. Thank you for your time. My private secretary will see you out. After the officials left, Catherine sank into her chair, the stress of the confrontation finally showing. They were reading from the surveillance files, weren't they? They knew details about my conversations with Dr. Akseni, Hassan, that they couldn't have known otherwise. Sarah nodded grimly. The language was nearly identical to the investigation reports I discovered this morning. Someone provided them with detailed intelligence about your activities. What do we do now? Sarah thought about the explicit threat Whitfield had made about Catherine's future role. Now we find out who really authorized this investigation and what they're ultimately trying to achieve. Because this isn't just about your charitable work anymore. They're threatening your position within the royal family itself. Catherine looked out the window at the gardens where her children were playing under the watchful eyes of their protection officers. Detective Inspector, I want you to know that regardless of the consequences, I will not be intimidated into abandoning work that I believe is morally necessary. These families need advocates, and I will continue to be one. Sarah felt a profound sense of respect for the woman sitting across from her. Catherine was facing pressure from the highest levels of government and possibly the royal household itself, but her commitment to protecting vulnerable people remained unshaken. Your Royal Highness, you have my complete loyalty and support. We'll get to the bottom of this investigation and find a way to protect both you and the families you're working to help. As Sarah left the palace that evening, she knew the real battle was just beginning. Someone powerful enough to mobilize government resources was determined to silence Catherine's advocacy work, and they had made it clear they were willing to threaten her position within the royal family to achieve their goals. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Stop interfering or face the consequences. This is your only warning. Someone was watching her as well now. The investigation had expanded beyond Catherine to include anyone who might support or protect her. Sarah deleted the message and increased her pace toward her car. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she needed to develop a strategy for fighting an enemy who seemed to have resources throughout the government and possibly the royal household itself. As she drove through the London streets, Sarah reflected on how quickly everything had changed. This morning she had been a security officer doing routine paperwork. Tonight she was at the center of what appeared to be a conspiracy involving the highest levels of British power. The only thing she knew for certain was that she had chosen the right side, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah Matthews arrived at her flat in Putney at 9:30 that evening, exhausted but too wired to sleep. The threatening text message had been deleted, but its implications lingered in her mind as she climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment. Someone knew about her involvement in protecting Catherine, and they were prepared to escalate beyond mere surveillance. Her flat was modest but comfortable, reflecting the practical sensibilities of a career police officer. Sarah had lived alone since her divorce 3 years earlier, finding solace in the order and quiet of her own space. But tonight, even her sanctuary felt compromised. As she turned on the lights and checked the windows, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The investigation files were locked in her desk at the palace, but Sarah had photographed key documents with her personal phone before leaving work. She spread printed copies across her kitchen table, studying them again under the bright overhead light. The more she examined the surveillance reports, the more convinced she became that this operation went far beyond routine security assessment. Someone had invested considerable resources in monitoring Catherine's every move for 3 months. The technical capabilities required phone intercepts, photographic surveillance, detailed analysis of social interactions, suggested involvement by professional intelligence services. But which service, and under whose authority? Sarah's laptop chimed with an encrypted email from Chief Inspector Harrison. Need to meet tomorrow morning before shift. Important developments. Delete this message. She followed his instructions and deleted the email, then spent the next 2 hours researching the bureaucratic structure that would be required to authorize such surveillance of a royal family member. The legal frameworks were complex and deliberately obscure, but certain patterns became clear. Any domestic surveillance of the royal family would require authorization at the cabinet level, probably from the Prime Minister personally. The intelligence services had strict protocols about investigating British citizens, and these protocols were even more restrictive when it came to the royal household. If the investigation into Catherine was legitimate, there would be a clear paper trail of approvals. But if it wasn't legitimate, then someone was conducting an unauthorized intelligence operation against the Princess of Wales. The implications of that possibility were staggering. It would represent not just a criminal conspiracy, but a direct attack on the constitutional monarchy itself. Sarah was reviewing the psychological profile again when her doorbell rang. It was nearly 11 o'clock, far too late for casual visitors. She approached the door carefully, checking the peephole before opening it. Detective Constable James Wilson stood in the hallway, looking agitated and glancing frequently over his shoulder. Sarah opened the door immediately, noting that he appeared to have been running. "James, what's wrong? How did you know where I live?" He entered quickly, and Sarah locked the door behind him. "Inspector, I think we have a serious problem. After you left tonight, I received orders to report to a special briefing tomorrow morning." Not through normal channels, a direct call from someone claiming to represent the cabinet office. Sarah's blood chilled. What kind of briefing? Security assessment of palace personnel. They specifically mentioned your name and asked detailed questions about your recent activities and associations. They seemed particularly interested in your interactions with Her Royal Highness's protection detail. Sarah guided Wilson to the living room, her mind racing. "Who called you? Did you recognize the voice?" Never heard it before. Middle-aged man, very official manner. He had my personal mobile number and knew details about my work schedule that aren't generally available. When I asked for written confirmation of the briefing, he said it was verbal orders only due to security considerations. This was escalating faster than Sarah had anticipated. By involving her team members, whoever was behind the investigation was expanding the scope of their operation significantly. James, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Have you noticed anything unusual about security protocols lately? Any orders or procedures that seemed outside normal channels? Wilson thought for a moment. Actually, yes. 2 weeks ago, I was asked to provide detailed reports on Her Royal Highness's interactions with charity workers and beneficiaries. I was told it was for a routine security review, but the level of detail they wanted seemed excessive. Sarah showed Wilson some of the surveillance photographs from the investigation files. Do you recognize any of these locations or situations? Wilson studied the images, his expression growing more concerned with each photograph. These are from the charity events I was assigned to monitor. But Inspector, these photos were taken from positions that weren't covered by our security detail. Someone else was conducting surveillance at the same time we were. The pieces were falling into place. The investigation team had been operating parallel surveillance alongside the official security detail, using Wilson's reports to supplement their own intelligence gathering. James, I believe you've been unknowingly contributing to an unauthorized surveillance operation targeting the Princess of Wales. The reports you were asked to provide were not for legitimate security purposes. Wilson sat back heavily in his chair. My God. Inspector, what do we do? If I'd been compromising her security, you were following orders that appeared legitimate. But now we need to decide how to proceed. Tomorrow's briefing could be an attempt to further compromise palace security, or to gather intelligence about our investigation into these surveillance activities. Sarah explained her discovery of the investigation files and her meeting with Catherine earlier that day. Wilson listened with growing alarm as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This is massive, he said when she finished. If someone is using government resources to conduct unauthorized surveillance of the royal family, we're talking about a potential coup attempt. Sarah had been thinking the same thing, though she was reluctant to voice such a dramatic conclusion. But the evidence pointed toward a systematic effort to undermine Catherine's position and influence within the royal family. James, I need you to attend tomorrow's briefing, but I want you to document everything. Record the conversation if possible. Get names and credentials, and report back to me immediately afterward. Can you do that? Of course. But Inspector, if this is as serious as we think it is, shouldn't we be involving higher authorities? We are involving higher authorities. Chief Inspector Harrison is already aware of the situation. But we need to be careful about who we trust until we understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Wilson left after midnight, using the building's rear exit to avoid any surveillance that might be monitoring Sarah's flat. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on how quickly her world had changed. 24 hours ago, she had been a loyal security officer concerned about unusual paperwork. Now she was at the center of what appeared to be a conspiracy involving the highest levels of British government. She set multiple alarms and placed her service weapon within easy reach before trying to sleep. The threatening text message suggested that her investigation had not gone unnoticed, and she needed to be prepared for further escalation. Thursday morning brought gray skies and steady rain, matching Sarah's mood as she arrived at Kensington Palace an hour before her usual start time. Chief Inspector Harrison was waiting for her in his office, nursing a cup of strong tea and looking like he hadn't slept much either. Sarah, we need to talk. I've spent the night making inquiries about the authorization for this investigation into the Princess of Wales. He activated the sound masking equipment and gestured for her to close the door. I've checked with every official channel that would be involved in authorizing domestic surveillance of royal family members. The Cabinet Office has no record of any investigation. The intelligence services have no active operations targeting palace personnel. The Metropolitan Police Special Branch has received no requests for assistance with royal family surveillance. Sarah felt both relief and terror. So the investigation is completely unauthorized? It appears so, which means we're dealing with a rogue operation using official government seals and procedures. Someone has gone to considerable effort to create the appearance of legitimacy while operating outside all normal channels. This changed everything. If the surveillance was unauthorized,
then Catherine was the victim of what amounted to criminal conspiracy. But it also meant that the people behind it had access to government resources and procedures without official approval. Chief Inspector, who has the capability to conduct this kind of operation without official authorization? Harrison walked to the window, watching the morning shift change in the palace courtyard. Very few organizations have the resources and technical capabilities we've seen evidence of. Foreign intelligence services, certainly. Private security contractors with government connections. Or, he paused, and Sarah sensed he was reluctant to voice his conclusion. Or elements within our own intelligence services, acting without authorization. A rogue faction with access to official resources but pursuing their own agenda. The implications were staggering.
If elements within British intelligence were conducting unauthorized surveillance of the royal family, it represented a fundamental breakdown of democratic oversight and constitutional authority. What do we do now? Harrison returned to his desk and opened a secured file folder. We document everything, build an ironclad case, and take it to the highest possible authority. But we have to be very careful about who we approach, because we don't know how deep this conspiracy goes. He handed Sarah a list of names and contact information. These are the only people I trust completely within the intelligence and security services. If we need external support, we start with them. Sarah studied the list, recognizing several senior officials known for their integrity and independence. What about protecting the princess in the meantime? We maintain normal security protocols, but add additional layers of protection without announcing our concerns. I'm authorizing increased surveillance detection measures and enhanced electronic countermeasures for all royal family activities. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Wilson. Briefing moved to off-site location. Address attached. This feels wrong. She showed the message to Harrison, who immediately became alert. That's a classic intelligence service maneuver, moving meetings to controlled environments where they can monitor everything that's said. Should I order him not to attend? Harrison considered this. No, but we prepare for multiple scenarios. If Wilson doesn't report back within 2 hours of the scheduled meeting, we assume he's been compromised and escalate immediately. The morning progressed with increasing tension. Catherine's schedule included a visit to a women's shelter in South London, followed by a private lunch with Dr. Hassan to discuss upcoming refugee assistance initiatives. Both events would provide opportunities for the surveillance team to gather additional intelligence or apply further pressure. At 10 o'clock, Sarah received a call from Torres, who was with Catherine's protection detail at the women's shelter. Inspector, we have a problem. The same woman from yesterday's charity event is here again, but this time she's inside the facility claiming to be a social worker conducting interviews. Sarah felt alarm bells going off. Have you verified her credentials? We're working on it, but the shelter staff seemed confused about her authorization to be there. She arrived before us and had detailed knowledge of today's schedule. Do not allow Her Royal Highness to be alone with this woman under any circumstances. If necessary, create a security incident to separate them. Sarah coordinated with local police to investigate the woman's identity while monitoring the situation through the security feeds. The surveillance operation was becoming more aggressive, moving from passive observation to active infiltration of Catherine's activities. At 11:30, Wilson should have been reporting back from his briefing, but Sarah heard nothing. She tried calling his personal phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Harrison authorized a wellness check at Wilson's flat, but responding officers found it empty, with no indication of where he might have gone. By noon, it was clear that Wilson had been compromised. Someone had used the fake briefing to remove him from circulation, either to interrogate him about palace security or to prevent him from reporting back about the conspiracy. Sarah made a decision that would have consequences throughout the British establishment. She called the emergency number Harrison had provided and spoke the code phrase that would activate the highest levels of security alert. This is Detective Inspector Matthews, Palace Security. We have a potential compromise of royal family security requiring immediate intervention at the highest levels. Authorization code Sierra 7 Alpha. The response was immediate and professional. Inspector Matthews, this is Director Campbell, Joint Intelligence Committee. We're mobilizing a response team immediately. Maintain current positions and await further instructions. Sarah had crossed the final line. She had officially reported a potential conspiracy against the royal family to the Joint Intelligence Services, triggering protocols that hadn't been used since the IRA bombing campaigns of the 1970s. As she waited for the response team to arrive, Sarah reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this point. Catherine's commitment to helping refugee families had somehow threatened powerful interests enough to trigger an unauthorized surveillance operation. The investigation had escalated to intimidation, and now apparent kidnapping of police officers. But Sarah was no longer fighting alone. The full resources of British intelligence and security services were now mobilizing to protect Catherine and investigate the conspiracy. Whatever happened next, the truth would finally come to light. Her phone buzzed with another encrypted message from an unknown sender. "You have made a serious mistake. There are consequences for those who interfere with matters of national security." Sarah deleted the message and checked her weapon. The conspiracy was desperate enough to threaten a police officer investigating unauthorized surveillance. That desperation suggested they were close to achieving their goals, whatever those might be. But it also suggested they had something to hide that was worth risking exposure to protect. Sarah was determined to discover what that secret was, regardless of the personal cost. The Joint Intelligence Committee's response team arrived at Kensington Palace within 90 minutes of Sarah's emergency call, transforming the normally quiet security wing into a hub of intense activity. Director Campbell himself led the team, a silver-haired man in his early 60s whose calm demeanor masked decades of experience in handling national security crises. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of briefing some of the most senior intelligence officials in the British government about a conspiracy that appeared to reach into their own organizations. The secure briefing room had been expanded to accommodate additional personnel, and electronic countermeasure equipment hummed quietly in the background as she presented her evidence. Director Campbell, based on our investigation, someone with access to government resources has been conducting unauthorized surveillance of the Princess of Wales for at least 3 months. This surveillance has escalated to intimidation, threats against security personnel, and now the apparent detention of one of my officers. Campbell studied the investigation files Sarah had provided, his expression growing more serious with each document. "Inspector Matthews, these files bear official government seals and follow standard intelligence service formatting. If they're unauthorized, someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create authentic-looking documentation." Sarah had been dreading this moment. "Sir, that's exactly what makes this conspiracy so dangerous. Whoever is behind it has access to official procedures, seals, and formatting standards that should only be available to authorized personnel." Deputy Director Sarah Thornton, a sharp-featured woman who led the Domestic Intelligence Division, leaned forward. "Inspector, you mentioned that Detective Constable Wilson was called to a briefing that we now know was fraudulent. Do we have any leads on who made that call or where the briefing was supposed to take place?" "We have the address where Wilson was directed to go, but when we checked the location, it was an empty office building that's been vacant for 6 months. However, the building does have security cameras that might have captured images of anyone who accessed it yesterday." Campbell assigned a team to investigate the building while Sarah continued her briefing. As she described the escalating pressure on Catherine, from the surveillance at charity events to the intimidating visit from supposed cabinet office officials, the intelligence officials exchanged increasingly concerned glances. The pattern suggests a sophisticated operation aimed at isolating the princess from her support networks and limiting her charitable activities, Sarah concluded. Someone wants to control or neutralize her influence, and they're willing to use surveillance, intimidation, and possibly kidnapping to achieve that goal. Campbell set down the files and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appear to be dealing with an unauthorized intelligence operation targeting a senior member of the royal family. This represents a direct threat to constitutional authority and democratic oversight. I'm authorizing a full investigation with priority alpha status." As the response team organized their investigation, Sarah was pulled aside by Deputy Director Thornton. "Inspector Matthews, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Is there any possibility that this surveillance operation was authorized through channels you weren't aware of? Sometimes security operations involving the royal family are compartmentalized for operational security." Sarah had considered this possibility extensively. "Ma'am, I've worked palace security for 12 years. I understand compartmentalization, but this operation shows all the signs of unauthorized activity. The psychological profiling, the intimidation tactics, the threats against personnel. These are not standard security procedures.
Thornton nodded thoughtfully. I tend to agree, but we need to be absolutely certain before we proceed. The implications of accusing elements within our own intelligence services of conducting rogue operations are enormous. As they spoke, Catherine arrived at the palace after cutting short her morning engagements. Torres had briefed her on Wilson's disappearance and the activation of emergency security protocols. She requested an immediate meeting with the investigation team, despite security concerns about her involvement in an active intelligence operation. Sarah escorted Catherine to the expanded briefing room, where Director Campbell was coordinating the multi-agency response. Catherine's entrance commanded immediate attention from the senior officials, most of whom had never met her personally despite their roles in protecting the royal family. Director Campbell, Catherine began without preamble. I understand that Detective Inspector Matthews has reported serious security concerns related to surveillance of my activities. I want to provide any information that might help your investigation. Campbell gestured for Catherine to take a seat at the conference table. Your Royal Highness, we appreciate your cooperation. Can you tell us about any unusual incidents or pressure you've experienced in recent months? Catherine described the escalating constraints on her charitable activities, the mysterious phone calls, and the intimidating meeting with the supposed cabinet office officials. As she spoke, Sarah noticed the intelligence officials taking detailed notes and exchanging significant looks. The most concerning aspect, Catherine continued, is that someone seems to have detailed knowledge of my private conversations and meetings. Information that should only be available to my immediate staff or security detail has somehow been compromised. Deputy Director Thornton leaned forward. Your Royal Highness, have you discussed your charitable activities or refugee assistance work with anyone outside your immediate circle? Perhaps at social events or informal gatherings? Catherine considered this carefully. I've spoken publicly about refugee assistance at various charity events and official engagements, but the surveillance reports that Detective Inspector Matthews showed me contained details about private conversations that were never intended for public consumption. Sarah provided the intelligence team with copies of the most concerning surveillance reports, pointing out the level of detail that suggested electronic eavesdropping capabilities. These transcripts could only have been obtained through unauthorized phone tapping or electronic surveillance of private meeting spaces. The investigation was interrupted by an urgent call from the team investigating the vacant office building where Wilson had been directed. They had found evidence of recent occupation, including surveillance equipment and what appeared to be an interrogation setup. More disturbing, they had discovered Wilson's personal phone and security credentials abandoned in a waste bin. Campbell's expression darkened as he received this report. Inspector Matthews, we're now treating this as a potential kidnapping of a police officer. I'm authorizing additional protective measures for all palace security personnel and expanding our investigation to include possible foreign intelligence involvement. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. Wilson's abandonment at the fake briefing location confirmed their worst fears about the conspiracy's willingness to use violence. But the involvement of the highest levels of British intelligence also meant they now had the resources to fight back effectively. Catherine requested a private word with Sarah and Campbell, leading them to a smaller adjacent room. Once the door was closed and the sound masking equipment activated, her composed public demeanor gave way to barely controlled anger. Director Campbell, I need to know if my children are safe. If someone is willing to kidnap police officers, they might target my family directly. Campbell's response was immediate and reassuring. Your Royal Highness, we're implementing enhanced protective measures for all family members immediately. Additional security teams are being deployed, and we're reviewing all access protocols for royal residences. Catherine turned to Sarah. Detective Inspector, I also need to know if Dr. Hassan and the refugee families I work with are in danger. These people have already been through tremendous trauma. I won't allow them to be victimized again because of their association with me. Sarah had been thinking about this exact issue. Your Royal Highness, I recommend that we warn Dr. Hassan immediately and provide protective measures for any families who might be at risk. If this conspiracy is willing to target police officers, they won't hesitate to intimidate refugees who have no official protection. Campbell agreed to extend protection to Catherine's key associates, but he also raised a troubling possibility. Your Royal Highness, we need to consider that your charitable work may have inadvertently intersected with other security concerns. Sometimes domestic operations can be triggered by foreign intelligence activities or threats that aren't immediately apparent. Catherine's voice became ice cold. Director Campbell, are you suggesting that my work with refugees has somehow compromised national security? Not at all. But we need to understand why someone would invest this level of resources in monitoring your activities. The surveillance operation we've uncovered represents a significant financial and operational commitment. Someone believes your charitable work threatens their interests substantially. As they returned to the main briefing room, Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown sender. Wilson is safe for now. Cease your investigation or he will not remain so. You have 12 hours to comply. Sarah showed the message to Campbell, who immediately authorized technical analysis to track its origin. Inspector Matthews, this confirms that Wilson is being held by the conspiracy. But it also suggests they're feeling pressure from our investigation. The message triggered a new phase of the investigation. Campbell authorized surveillance of known safe houses and communication intercepts targeting suspected conspiracy members. But he also implemented new security protocols for all personnel involved in the investigation, recognizing that the conspiracy was prepared to escalate to violence. Catherine surprised everyone by requesting to remain involved in the investigation despite the obvious risks. Director Campbell, these people are using my charitable work as justification for their actions. I have a right to understand what they're really after and to help stop them. Campbell was reluctant to involve a senior royal in an active intelligence operation, but Catherine's intimate knowledge of the surveillance activities made her participation valuable. They agreed on a limited role that would allow her to provide information while minimizing her exposure to danger. The afternoon brought a breakthrough when the technical analysis team successfully traced the threatening message to a server located in a government facility in Whitehall. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team, confirming their worst fears about the conspiracy's reach into official government systems. This message was sent from inside a secure government network, reported the lead technical analyst. Someone with authorized access to classified systems is coordinating the conspiracy. Campbell's response was swift and decisive. We're dealing with a rogue faction within the government itself. I'm activating Code Red protocols and requesting emergency authorization from the Prime Minister for a full internal security investigation. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Sarah realized they were facing something far more dangerous than she had initially imagined. Someone within the British government was using official resources to conduct an unauthorized surveillance and intimidation campaign against the Princess of Wales. The discovery of Wilson's kidnapping confirmed their willingness to use violence against anyone who interfered with their plans. But the investigation had also revealed the conspiracy's vulnerabilities. Their use of government systems had left digital fingerprints that could be traced. Their escalation to kidnapping had triggered the highest levels of security response, and their threats against Catherine had unified the intelligence community against them. As evening approached, Sarah found herself at the center of what was becoming one of the most significant internal security investigations in British history. The conspiracy had originated as surveillance of Catherine's charitable work, but it had revealed deeper tensions about power, influence, and the role of the royal family in contemporary politics. The next 12 hours would determine whether the conspiracy succeeded in silencing Catherine's advocacy work, or whether the full force of British intelligence would be brought to bear against those who had dared to threaten constitutional authority itself. Sarah checked her weapon and prepared for what promised to be the longest night of her career. Wilson was depending on their investigation for his safe return, Catherine was depending on them for protection of her family and her work, and the constitutional monarchy itself might depend on their success in stopping a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. The threatening message had given them 12 hours to cease their investigation. Sarah was determined to use those 12 hours to bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. The war room at Thames House buzzed with controlled urgency as Britain's most senior intelligence officials worked through the night to unravel a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of constitutional monarchy. Director Campbell had relocated the entire operation to MI5 headquarters, where secure communications and advanced surveillance capabilities could be fully utilized without risk of compromise from within the palace security systems. Sarah Matthews found herself in the surreal position of coordinating with intelligence analysts and counter-surveillance specialists as they traced the digital fingerprints left by the rogue operation. The threatening message demanding cessation of their investigation had provided the breakthrough they needed. Every keystroke, every network access, every system login was now being analyzed to identify the conspiracy's members. Inspector Matthews called technical analyst Rebecca Chen from across the room. "We've identified the source terminal for yesterday's threatening message. It was sent from a workstation registered to someone calling himself Deputy Secretary James Whitfield." Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with alarm. "That's one of the men who visited the princess yesterday claiming to represent Cabinet Office concerns about her charitable work. But when we checked his credentials, there is no Deputy Secretary James Whitfield in the Cabinet Office," confirmed Deputy Director Thornton. "The identity appears to be completely fabricated, but whoever is using it has legitimate access to high-security government networks. The investigation was revealing a sophisticated operation that had been months in the planning. The conspiracy had created false identities, established fake authorization channels, and developed detailed psychological profiles of their target. But their use of official government systems had left an electronic trail that was now being systematically unraveled." Catherine arrived at Thames House at 2 o'clock in the morning, having insisted on participating despite security concerns. She brought with her Dr. Pith, Amara Hassan, whose perspective as both a refugee advocate and a potential target of the surveillance might provide crucial insights into the conspiracy's ultimate goals. "Director Campbell," Catherine began as she was escorted to the secure briefing room. "Dr. Hassan has received threatening phone calls similar to the ones I experienced. Someone is systematically targeting everyone involved in our refugee assistance programs." Dr. Hassan, an elegant woman in her early 40s with the composed bearing of someone who had survived genuine persecution, addressed the intelligence officials directly. "I've worked with refugee communities for 10 years, including in Syria, before I was forced to flee myself. I recognize the techniques being used against us. Systematic surveillance, isolation from support networks, psychological pressure designed to force compliance or withdrawal from public activities." Sarah realized that Dr. Hassan's experience with authoritarian surveillance tactics might provide valuable insight into the conspiracy's methods and objectives. "Dr. Quenti, Hassan, based on your experience, what do you think these people are ultimately trying to achieve?" Dr. Hassan considered the question carefully. In authoritarian systems, surveillance and intimidation of humanitarian advocates serves two purposes. First, it silences specific voices that challenge government policy. But more importantly, it sends a message to the broader community that helping vulnerable people is dangerous and unwelcome. The room fell silent as the implications of this analysis sank in. The conspiracy wasn't just targeting Catherine personally. It was attempting to undermine the entire network of refugee assistance and social justice advocacy that had grown up around her charitable work. "If that's their goal," Catherine said quietly, "then they're not just threatening me. They're threatening every family I've worked with, every charity I've supported, every advocate who has been encouraged by seeing a senior royal speaking out on these issues." Campbell leaned forward, his expression grave. "Your Royal Highness, that level of systemic intimidation would require significant resources and coordination. We're not talking about a small rogue operation. This would need backing from very senior levels within government or the intelligence services." As if summoned by his words, Campbell's secure phone buzzed with an urgent message. He read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've identified at least 3 senior officials within the Home Office and 2 within the intelligence services who appear to be coordinating this operation. This is bigger than we initially suspected." The investigation had reached a critical juncture. They now had evidence of a conspiracy involving senior government officials, but moving against such high-level targets would require political authorization from the very highest levels. Campbell excused himself to make secure calls to the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet Secretary. While they waited for political clearance to expand the investigation, Sarah worked with the technical analysis team to map the full scope of the surveillance operation. What they discovered was breathtaking in its ambition and scope. Inspector Matthews, reported analyst Chen, "The surveillance network extends far beyond the Princess of Wales. We found evidence of monitoring activities targeting at least 50 individuals involved in refugee assistance work, including charity directors, social workers, legal advocates, and volunteer coordinators. Sarah felt sick as the true scale of the conspiracy became clear. They weren't just targeting Catherine, they were systematically mapping the entire refugee advocacy network in the United Kingdom. Dr. Hassan nodded grimly. This is exactly what authoritarian governments do when they want to crush civil society organizations. First, you identify all the key players and their relationships. Then you apply pressure selectively to force them to withdraw from their activities. Catherine's voice was steel when she spoke. They're using the royal family's influence as leverage. If they can force me to abandon refugee advocacy work, it sends a message that such activities are too dangerous even for someone with constitutional protection. The implications extended far beyond Catherine's personal charitable choices. The conspiracy represented an attempt to reshape British civil society by intimidating advocates for vulnerable populations. If they succeeded in silencing a senior royal, they could certainly intimidate ordinary citizens who lacked constitutional protection. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Campbell returned with authorization for a full-scale investigation involving arrest powers for the suspected conspiracy members. The Prime Minister himself had been briefed on the situation and had authorized whatever measures were necessary to protect the royal family and preserve democratic oversight of the intelligence services. "We're moving against the conspiracy at dawn," Campbell announced. "Simultaneous arrests of all identified participants, seizure of their electronic devices and documents, and a comprehensive audit of their activities over the past year." But even as they prepared for the raids, the conspiracy made one final desperate move. Sarah's secure phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When she answered, she heard Wilson's voice for the first time since his disappearance. "Inspector Matthews, I'm safe, but I need to tell you what I learned while they held me. This conspiracy goes higher than we thought. They've been planning this for months, and Catherine's refugee work was just the trigger for something much larger." Wilson's voice was strained but urgent. "They're planning to use the surveillance evidence to force changes in immigration policy, claiming that refugee assistance programs represent security threats. Catherine's advocacy was interfering with their agenda, so they decided to neutralize her influence." Sarah felt the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The conspiracy wasn't really about Catherine at all. It was about using her as a symbol to justify broader restrictions on humanitarian assistance and refugee protection. "James, where are you? Are you safe to move? I escaped about an hour ago. They were holding me in a safe house in East London, but they got careless when they thought you would back down. Inspector, they have contingency plans. If the arrests happen this morning, they're prepared to release selected surveillance materials to the media to justify their actions." Campbell, who had been monitoring the call, immediately coordinated with the media liaison teams to prepare counter-narratives that would expose the surveillance as illegal rather than legitimate security work. As dawn approached, Sarah found herself in an unmarked vehicle with Catherine and Dr. Hassan, observing the coordinated arrests from a secure distance. The conspiracy had operated for months believing they were untouchable, but the British intelligence community's response had been swift and comprehensive once the threat was recognized. The first arrest was Deputy Secretary James Whitfield, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Pemberton, a former intelligence officer who had been recruited by the conspiracy 6 months earlier. His arrest at a Whitehall office building was followed by simultaneous raids at locations across London and Surrey. Within 2 hours, 8 senior officials had been arrested and their communication networks dismantled. The evidence seized in the raids would provide material for prosecutions that could reach the highest levels of the civil service and intelligence community. "Your Royal Highness," Campbell reported as the operation concluded, "we've successfully neutralized the immediate threat. The conspiracy has been dismantled, and Detective Constable Wilson is safe in receiving medical attention." Catherine's relief was visible, but her voice remained determined. "Director Campbell, I want to understand what protections will be put in place to prevent this from happening again. Not just to me, but to any advocate working with vulnerable communities." The question went to the heart of democratic governance and constitutional protection. Campbell assured her that new oversight mechanisms would be implemented, but Sarah understood that the deeper issue was cultural and political rather than merely procedural. As they returned to Kensington Palace in the early morning light, Catherine turned to Sarah with a question that would define both their futures. "Detective Inspector Matthews, I want to expand my charitable work rather than retreat from it. Will you help me build advocacy networks that are stronger and more resilient than before?" Sarah realized that their experience had transformed both of them. Catherine had faced down a government conspiracy and emerged more committed than ever to protecting vulnerable people. Sarah had discovered that true security sometimes required protecting democratic values against internal threats rather than external ones. Your Royal Highness, it would be an honor to help build those networks. But this time, we'll make sure they're protected by proper oversight and constitutional safeguards. The investigation had lasted less than 72 hours, but its impact would reshape British intelligence oversight for years to come. The conspiracy's attempt to intimidate and control Catherine's charitable work had backfired spectacularly, resulting instead in enhanced protections for civil society advocates and stronger constitutional safeguards for the royal family's independence. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the garden at Kensington Palace as Catherine announced the establishment of a new foundation for refugee assistance, with Dr. Hassan as its director and enhanced security protections for all advocates working with vulnerable communities. The conspiracy had intended to silence humanitarian work, but had instead strengthened it immeasurably. Wilson, fully recovered from his ordeal, had been promoted to detective inspector and assigned to lead a new unit focused on protecting civil society organizations from domestic surveillance threats. The conspiracy's former members were serving lengthy prison sentences for their unauthorized surveillance activities and kidnapping. As Sarah watched Catherine speak with refugee families whose lives had been transformed by the advocacy work that someone had tried to silence, she reflected on the choices that had brought them to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been a routine security officer discovering suspicious paperwork. Today, she was helping to protect democratic values that had been under attack from within the government itself. The investigation had taught her that security sometimes meant protecting people from their own institutions, rather than from foreign enemies. It had shown her that courage could be as simple as choosing to act on your convictions when everything you valued was at stake. But most importantly, it had demonstrated that in a democratic society, truth and justice could prevail even against the most sophisticated and well-resourced conspiracies, as long as dedicated people were willing to risk everything to defend constitutional principles and human dignity. The Guard had successfully shielded Catherine from the secret investigation, but in doing so, she had helped preserve something far more valuable than one person's charitable work. She had helped preserve the principle that in a democratic society, no one, not even the most senior government officials, was above the law or beyond accountability for their actions.